What's up guys, and welcome back to Retro Gamer Gen X's Retro Gaming channel. And in today's video we're going to be checking out retro video game consoles and handhelds from the 1980s. Now if you missed the first video in this series, it's a retro video game consoles and handhelds from the 1970s. I'm going to post a link right here to that. I would suggest watching that first because it kind of shows how this whole industry started and all the companies and engineers and everything that was involved. And then it kind of goes on into the 1980s. However, if you guys don't know about these kind of videos, at the end of each year I always post these retro video game history videos. Now they're just a mashup of my look at and my other history videos that I do throughout the year. This one, it was actually going to be about 4.5 hours long, so I had to split it up by decade. That way I can keep it to just about an hour per episode. And before every video, I go ahead and put a commercial for that specific video game system in there, just showing how it was marketing. The marketing in these video game systems are just really kind of cool just to see how they did it. So at first, like in the 1970s, they were marketed it more towards the adults. And then by the 1980s, definitely were marketing these systems more towards kids. Now, I also wanted to thank all my subscribers and all my viewers for helping support the channel over the past year and a half. It's just been one heck of a ride doing all these YouTube videos, showing you all these video game consoles and just sharing the history and everything about them. Now, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you like the content, hit a like and then hit that notification bell. That way you get notifications every time I drop new content like this. And also, if you wanted to help support the channel, go ahead and click that super thanks down below. Any support that I get to the channel would be greatly appreciated, and I'll go ahead and roll you in the credits in the next video as well. But without further ado, guys, let's go ahead and take a look at retro video game consoles and handhelds of the 1980s.
Let's face it, being sick is better than being in school. But it does get a little boring. I mean, how many Laverne and Shirley reruns can a guy watch? That's why this pocket pinball game is just what the doctor ordered. It's lots of fun, and it's small enough to play anywhere. And the built-in alarm tells you when it's time to get more sympathy. Mom, I need something to drink. You gotta milk a good thing for all it's worth.
Pinball, the onboard game by Nintendo.
The story of the Game & Watch starts in the 1970s when game designer Gunpei Yokoi, head of Nintendo's research and development of its toys and games division, took a train ride home and noticed a businessman on the train playing with a calculator. This is when the thought came to his head that he could make a game out of calculator parts. An affordable electronic game that you can use to kill time while waiting in line or on train rides seemed like a perfect idea. When he got back to Nintendo, he pitched the idea to Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi. After the pitch, Yamauchi asked Yokoi to chauffeur him to a business meeting. I'm sure that request seemed odd, but Yokoi obliged. It turns out that the business meeting was with the CEO of Sharp, and Yamauchi wanted Yokoi to pitch his idea at this meeting. Nintendo and Sharp struck a deal to use Sharp's SN500 series 4-bit microcontrollers for this project. Yokoi had full control over the development. He wanted a game controller kind of like the arcade, and actually developed the D-pad. Before long, the first Game & Watch game was made, named Ball. It was a simple game just juggling balls on the LCD screen. This was the first of 60 games to be released on the platform. Nintendo has stated that it used the profit off the Game & Watches to develop the Famicom, which here in the US we all know as the NES, or the Nintendo Entertainment System. And without development of that system, Nintendo might not be the powerhouse they are today, and video game history may have been completely changed. With a launch date in 1980, and it being discontinued in 1991, the Game & Watch series had a successful 11-year run. During that time, Nintendo sold 43.3 million of these units, making it the Kickstarter for the Nintendo Entertainment System and for the Nintendo Corporation as a whole.
Now you can bring the arcade experience home. Introducing ColecoVision, the most advanced video game system you can buy. It plays more games than any other system. Arcade games with multiple screens like Donkey Kong. Arcade games like Zaxxon with its three-dimensional look. Adventure with 15 different screens. Cosmic Avenger. And ColecoVision's new Smurf game. Coming soon. ColecoVision's first expansion module that lets you play all the Atari VCS compatible cartridges. Now you can bring the arcade experience home because your vision is our vision. ColecoVision.
The story of the ColecoVision starts in the late 1970s. Coleco did well in the electronics video game market and wanted to continue their success. In 1979, Arnold Grainsberg wanted to create a programmable home video game console with arcade-quality games made up with off-the-shelf parts. Eric Brumley and his engineering team began to design the ColecoVision. In 1979, they had already developed a prototype system that used a Texas Instrument chip for the video and a General Instruments chip for the audio. But because of the high cost of RAM at the time, it was not approved but shelved for a later date. By early 1982, that later date had come. The cost of RAM had fallen, and Brumley saw that the cost was well within the profit margin now. Development of the ColecoVision was very fast, as the system was already developed and was just shelved. The ColecoVision was launched in August of 1982, and by Christmas of '82, had already sold over 500,000 units. In early 1983, more than 1 million units had already sold, greatly surpassing what their biggest rival, the Atari 5200, was doing. Sales were looking good, and Coleco decided to launch the Coleco Atom computer. Unfortunately, this was the beginning of the end for Coleco. The Atom was not a success, due to bad manufacturing and defects which gave Coleco a bad name. And then it happened, the video game crash. With horrible sales of the Atom, and the ColecoVision sales plummeting along with the sales of its games, by 1985 Coleco had announced a discontinuation of the Atom computer, and in October of the ColecoVision. This gave the Coleco a 37-month run, selling just under 2 million units in that time frame. Unfortunately for Coleco, the timing was just bad when they released it. Had they released it in 1979, we might still be playing Coleco video game systems today. Nobody would question the quality of the graphics and the games of the ColecoVision, far beating what Atari or any other video game system was doing at the time. Just another example of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Coleco went on to produce the Cabbage Patch Dolls, which kept them afloat for a few more years, but by 1988, Coleco had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and by 1989, what was left of Coleco was swallowed up by the toy giant Hasbro.
Give up my Atari? My television?
How about for this?
You bet your asteroid.
Introducing the revolutionary Vectrex arcade system. No TV set needed. Instead, Vectrex has a real arcade screen built in, so you get challenging real arcade graphics and sounds with every Vectrex cartridge. No wonder Vectrex was chosen 2-to-1 over Atari and Intellivision for real arcade gameplay. So compare. Discover how Vectrex brings real arcade play home.
The story of the Vectrex starts in the arcades of the late 70s and early 80s. Games like Asteroids, Tempest, and Lunar Lander were becoming all the rage due to their higher resolution vector graphics that conventional CRT and sprite arcade games just couldn't compete with at the time. Around this time in 1980, John Ross of Smith Engineering and some colleagues were shopping at the Electro Maven, an electronics surplus store that was located in California at the time. While there, John spotted a small CRT, about an inch in size, and thought about making a small electronic game using this CRT using vector graphics. They started working on a small handheld device they called the Mini Arcade. It used a standard CRT, but connected the deflection yoke to a stereo amp to produce visuals of the music being played. This was possible because they used an auxiliary yoke to run the horizontal flyback circuitry, producing graphics rather than scanline on a standard CRT. Although it didn't play games yet, it showed proof of concept that type displays could be made cheaply enough to produce a game console with it. Smith Engineering then started to show the device off, trying to find an investor or company to buy it. During this time, the system started to evolve from a handheld device to a tabletop console using a 9-inch screen. In 1981, General Consumer Electronics licensed the technology. This is when the Vectrex as we know it was developed. The hardware was approved upon, and the software was created so that games could be played on it. The hardware and the software being developed by Jerry Carr.
I am the Night Automated Roving Robot, the first in a bold new experiment. You may call me Carr.
No, not that Carr. This Carr, Jerry Carr. After a brief development period, the Vectrex was unveiled at the 1982 Summer CES show. People at the show marveled at the vector graphics that were displayed on the screen. some comparing it to being just like the arcade. The system was released just a few months later in November of 1982. Sales of the unit were so strong that it caught the attention of Milton Bradley. They bought the rights to the Vectrex from GCE and started production of the Milton Bradley Vectrex. By mid-1983, Milton Bradley had released the console in parts of Europe and struck a deal with Bandai to distribute it in Japan. However, 1983 is synonymous with the video game crash. Faith in the video game industry due to massive amounts of poor games being dumped into the market caused consumers to quit buying game consoles. Although the Vectrex was an amazing system, it too was affected by the decline in sales. To try to ramp up sales, Milton Bradley brought the cost of the system down by 25%, then 50%. This affected profits, and they were taking huge losses. In fact, they lost over $31 million on the Vectrex by 1984. By February 1984, Milton Bradley discontinued the console, liquidating the remaining inventory to wholesalers and discount warehouses. Due to how much they lost on the deal, in March, Milton Bradley merged with Hasbro, and all support for the system ended. Before it was discontinued, there were two accessories made for it: the 3D Imager, which was a headset that almost looked like a modern VR headset that you wore to produce color and 3D images from the vector screen, the first ever 3D headset. Also, they produced a light pen to use with some cartridges to draw on the screen. However, even these amazing peripherals could not save the Vectrex. The Vectrex was well received. Consumers loved the product, and so did tech magazines such as Byte. They stated in a 1982 review, "One of the greatest machines we have ever seen. The Vectrex is a good bet to score big with the consumer." Even with the screen overlays, which were not popular with other game consoles, they scored big.
You bet your asteroid.
The only real complaint consumers had was the buzzing noise that the machine made through its speaker. This was a design flaw that was fixed, or should I say fixed loosely, in a newer revision, getting rid of the ground loop that caused the issue. Unfortunately, the Vectrex was another great console that had a short lifespan because of the video game crash. With it being discontinued in 1982, it had a short 2-year lifespan from January of 1982 until February of 1984. Sales of the unit varied from source to source, but I'll say more than 30,000 units were sold in that time frame. It was the first and only video game console to bring arcade-quality vector graphics into the home.
Arcade players, get ready. The new Atari 5200 Super System is here. With a controller so advanced it plays arcade. Graphics so real it looks arcade. With arcade hits you can't play on any other system. No other home video system can touch it. The new Atari 5200 Super System. It's as good as you are, maybe even better. Next time.
In late 1977, Atari had already been purchased by Warner Communications. The story of the 5200 starts after that. Nolan Bushnell was still with the company, and Warner Communications had already started the successor of the 2600, and there was actually talks of them discontinuing it. Bushnell disagreed with this, and along with other issues that he had with Warner Communications, he decided to leave the company. That's how I'm going to tell it. Warner would probably tell it a different way, but I'm taking Bushnell's side of this story. Warner started development of the successor to the 2600, but 1977 is known as the year of the personal computer revolution. This is the year that the Apple II, Commodore PET, and the TRS-80 launched, bringing the personal computer to many homes and businesses. Atari had seen this and wanted in on the lucrative personal computing market, so instead of developing the next video game system, they used the technology to develop the Atari 8-bit line of computers. Now at this time, the only real competition that Atari had was the Fairchild Channel F, the Bally Astrocade, and the Magnavox Odyssey 2. But fast forward a couple years, and Mattel had released the Intellivision in 1979, and in 1982, Coleco released the ColecoVision, both of which had add-ons that could play the Atari 2600 cartridges and had superior graphics to the 2600. Atari knew that they had to do something, and they unshelved the console prototype from 1978. They developed it into the Atari Video System X, which a few prototypes were actually made. The name was changed to the Atari 5200. The 5200 was officially launched in November of 1982. Atari had released a decently powerful video game console to compete with the Coleco and Intellivision. However, the timing was completely wrong. The controllers were horrible, and the games were just the same old arcade ports like on the Atari 2600. And it wasn't backwards compatible with the 2600, nor was it compatible with the 8-bit line of computers. And because of this, consumers just couldn't justify the cost of buying a new game console for the same old games, but with a little bit better graphics, and of course it had the bad reputation for the controllers as well. After its release, it did sell a few units, but it did not meet Atari's sales expectations. Atari had even gone as far as designing a slim version of the Atari 5200 called the Atari 5200 Junior or the 5100. However, since sales were slow, this project was cancelled. A few of those prototypes do exist, and they're out there in the wild as well. And then in 1983, the video game crash came, and sales of the system plummeted, along with the sales of the Atari 2600. Atari discontinued the 5200 in May of 1984, giving it a lifespan of only 18 months. And shortly after this, Warner Communications sold Atari to Jack Tramiel. The 5200 just sold over 1 million units. Although it was a powerful machine, it was not a success for Atari.
Sega ビデオゲーム SG1000
The story of Sega starts in World War II in 1940. American businessmen Martin Bromley, Irving Bromberg, and James Humpert started Standard Games in Hawaii to supply coin-operated games such as slot machines to American bases during the war. The business also served the civilian market as well. It was successful, but after the war they sold Standard Games off and created a new company called Service Games, with its main focus being games for the military. In 1952, the U.S. government banned slot machines in U.S. territories, which took a chunk out of Service Games' pockets. To marginalize its losses, they established Service Games of Japan to provide slot machines to U.S. bases in Japan. A year later, they started Service Games of Panama to control their entities worldwide. In 1954, Service Games released a slot machine named Diamond 3-Star, and was the first product with the shortened Service Games name, abbreviated to Sega on it. In the next few years, they expanded their business to distribute machines in South Korea, the Philippines, and South Vietnam. By 1960, criminal organizations were starting to use slot machines in their unlicensed gambling houses. Because of this, the US government started an investigation into illegal gambling. Service Games saw that this was the end of their lucrative slot machine business and dissolved Service Games of Japan on May 31st. 3 days later, Bromley started two new businesses to take over the business that Service Games left behind: Nihon Goraku Busan and Nihon Kenkei Seizu. The two newly formed companies bought all the assets from Service Games of Japan. Kenkei Seizu started business as Sega Incorporated and focused solely on the slot machine business. Goraku Busan, doing business as Ultimatic, was a distributor of coin-op machines such as jukeboxes and pinball. In 1964, the companies merged into one. In 1965, Nihon Goraku Busan acquired Rosen Enterprises, another coin-op game company that was owned by David Rosen. After the acquisition, Nihon Goraku Busan changed its name to Sega Limited and stopped leasing games to military bases and focused solely on distributing coin-op amusement machines such as Rockola jukeboxes, Williams pinball machines, and Midway shooting games. Also at this time, Rosen was made CEO of Sega Limited. By the late 1960s, Sega had been distributing machines, but many of the machines broke and had to be fixed. Sega got sick of trying to outsource the parts needed to quickly get the machines running again, so they decided to make their own parts for the machines. This quickly evolved into Sega making their first electromechanical game called Periscope. With its amazing gameplay, effects, lights, and sounds, it was quite a success for Sega. In 1969, Sega Limited was sold off to American investor Gulf and Western Industries. In 1973, Sega made their first video game-based arcade game, Pongtron, a Pong clone. In 1974, Sega Limited changed their name again to Sega Enterprises Limited. Sega enjoyed success in the arcade video game market in the 1970s. So much so, it licensed Frogger and created the famous 3D shooter game Zaxxon. they acquired Gremlin Industries, a microprocessor-based arcade game manufacturer, in 1983. Also around this time, they acquired another company named Esko Baruki, a coin-op distributor owned by Hayao Nakayama. Nakayama was put into the president position at Sega's Japanese operations. But by 1982, the arcade industry started seeing a downfall in profits. Golf and Western sold off its North American arcade division to Bally Manufacturing in 1983, but retained American R&D division and its Sega Enterprises Limited division. Right around this time, Nakayama wanted to get into the home computer market. They started development of the SC3000. It was an 8-bit computer powered by a Z80 processor. Almost simultaneously, they heard that the game company Nintendo was creating a video game console for the home market. Sega wanted to get into this market as well. They took the same technology from the SC3000 computer and turned it into the home video game console named the SG1000. Both systems were released in 1983. The SG1000 became a success for Sega. Released the same day as Nintendo released the Famicom, it was only predicted to sell about 50,000 units by the end of the year. But by the end of 1983, they had sold over 160,000 units. However, the success didn't last. Due to Nintendo having third-party developers working on their games, the Famicom started to outsell the SG1000 by tenfold. Also in 1983, Golf and Western decided to divest the rest of their assets in Sega. Rosen stepped down as CEO and partnered with Nakayama to buy out Sega Enterprises. After the acquisition, Nakayama was named CEO of Sega Enterprises. In 1984, Sega released an updated version of the SG1000 called the SG1000 Mark II, or Mark II for short. This system was backward compatible with both the SC3000 and the SC1000's games. The case design was changed, putting the expansion port in the front, and it had detachable controllers as well. The SG1000 was discontinued in 1984 and the SG1000 Mark II and SC3000 in 1986 to make room for the next video game console, the Sega Mark III, which eventually became the Master System. The SG series of game consoles had a 3-year lifespan from the launch of the SG1000 in 1983 until the discontinuation of the SG1000 Mark II in 1986. The SG series of consoles sold over 1.4 million units in total. Although not a huge success, it was successful enough to kickstart Sega into the video game industry, and was Sega's first video game console.
What's it like to play the Nintendo Entertainment System? Entertainment System. Now you're playing with power.
The NES story starts in the arcades of the early 1980s. Nintendo's success with games such as Donkey Kong led Nintendo's president Harushi Yamauchi to call for a game console based on arcade machines like Galaxian and Donkey Kong. Originally, it was supposed to be a 16-bit home computer with floppy drives and a keyboard, but Yamauchi rejected this plan. He wanted a cheaper system that people didn't need to be technophiles to be able to use. At this point, Masuki Yorama began the design by October of 1982 and had a test model or prototype built. However, no programming tools were available, so programming started on the NEC PC-8001 computer, or the PC-88. The PC-88 connected to a grid of LEDs to create the graphics for the games. The project was named GameCom, but this name was actually changed to Famicom with the suggestion of Yorama's wife. The Famicom was heavily influenced by the ColecoVision. Nintendo saw how much better the games looked on the Coleco as opposed to other consoles like the Atari 2600. They really thought that they would be competing with Coleco in the future and wanted to come up with something that could produce arcade quality graphics. The console was released on July 15, 1983, only in Japan, with 3 games being released with the system at the time: Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. The console released with some issues due to some manufacturing defects. There were some issues with the chips inside that caused the system to crash. but after a recall, the Famicom enjoyed success, much success, and by 1984 was the best-selling console in Japan. Also in 1984, Nintendo agreed to have third-party publishers make games on it. The first two publishers were Namco and Hudson Soft. They agreed to a deal for a 30% fee to Nintendo for console licensing and production cost. This was an industry standard in the video game market up until 2010. Now Nintendo had its sights on North America. However, they were still skeptical of going into the market alone. In 1983, Nintendo started negotiations with Atari to market the Famicom under Atari's name in North America. The deal was supposed to be signed at the CES show in 1983. However, Atari saw a Nintendo Donkey Kong Coleco cartridge being used in a Coleco display, and at this point they nixed the deal with Nintendo. Now Nintendo decided to go for it on their own. The first idea was to package it as the Nintendo Advanced Video Game System, or AVS. This would include a repackaged Famicom, a keyboard, a cassette, a data recorder, and a wireless joystick, and a basic ROM cartridge. Nintendo decided against this as it would be too expensive for the regular consumer, and with the video game crash, they were worried that the console and computer just wouldn't sell. So Nintendo first used the Famicom hardware in North America in the Versus arcade cabinets. This was basically just a test to see how gamers would react to what was really a home video game console in a cabinet. It was a huge success. The Versus system became the highest grossing arcade cabinet by 1985 in the United States. With this, Nintendo went ahead and designed the North American Famicom system. The system would have a front-loading assembly that resembled a VCR for user familiarity. It also helped prevent ESD, or electronic static discharge, in dry climates like Nevada or Arizona. The new case was designed by Lance Barr. At this point, the Nintendo AVS system was renamed to the Nintendo Entertainment System. The change came due to Nintendo wanting to distance itself from the video game market after the crash, and that's why it's not called the Nintendo Video Game System. It released in two test markets, in New York City in October of 1985 and in Los Angeles in February of 1986. It was very successful in both of those markets, so Nintendo decided to release the NES nationwide on September 27, 1986. Now, as technology advanced, obviously game consoles are going to be discontinued. The NES was discontinued in 1995, giving it a 9-year run in the North American market. Now, the Famicom, on the other hand, was discontinued in the year 2000. So it gave the console a 17-year run on the market in Japan. Of course, over its lifetime, and all the different iterations from the Famicom to the NES, it sold about 62 million units, the best-selling console up to this point.
Sega challenges you with the ultimate video game, the Sega Master System, with twice as much memory as any other video game. Advanced video technology like scrolling backgrounds, graphics in 64 colors, digital sounds, and light phasers. And you can add to the excitement with sports pads, control sticks, and the first video games ever in 3D.
Sega's the one.
The Sega Master System. The challenge will always be there.
The story of the Sega Master System really starts in 1983. With the release of its first game console, the SG-1000 in Japan, it was released on the same day as Nintendo's Famicom, but unfortunately did not see the success that Nintendo did. In 1984, Sega's parent company, Golf and Western Industries, divested in non-core businesses, including Sega. Sega now owned itself, and put Nakayama as CEO of the newly founded Sega Enterprises. Also in 1984, Sega released another console called the SG-1000 Mark II. This featured several hardware revisions and detachable controllers. Then, in 1985, Sega released the Sega Mark III, which was another redesign of the original SG-1000. It was engineered by Hideki Soto and Masami Ishiwaka. According to Sato, the console was designed due to the limitations of the SG-1000's GPU, and they wanted something that would be able to compete with the graphics of the Nintendo. So they designed a new graphics chip based on the Sega System 2 arcade board. The Mark III was released in October of 1985 in Japan only. but they had problems finding publishers due to the licensing agreements that Nintendo already had set up with most companies. And once again, Sega had a console that was not very successful in Japan. Sega knew they had a great video game system and wanted to release it worldwide to compete with the likes of Nintendo and Atari. In 1986, Sega formed Sega of America with Bruce Lorry, Nintendo of America's former vice president of sales, heading this group. Rebranded as the Master System, the system itself was redesigned, appealing more to the American market. It was first revealed in the Summer CES show in Chicago in 1986. The console itself was launched in September of 1986 at a price of $200 in the United States. Sega hoped to sell more than 700,000 units by the end of 1986, but unfortunately, their projections fell short, only selling 125,000 units, while Nintendo at the same point sold more than 1.1 million units. Just like in Japan, Nintendo had licensing agreements with most American publishers, leading to Sega to develop pretty much their own video game library and not having the help of third-party developers. In 1987, Sega sold the distribution rights to the Master System to toy company Tonka. Nintendo had marketed the Nintendo Entertainment System as a toy, so Sega felt that if they marketed it with a toy company, it might increase sales. Tonka had purchased Kenner Toys in 1987, and after a horrible Christmas season, funds were running low for Tonka. In 1988, there was an EEPROM shortage. Tonka didn't want to buy the expensive EEPROMs, and not being able to distribute very many games for the Master System, further decreasing sales for Sega. Also in 1987, the Mark III was re-released as the Master System in Japan, and did not sell very well. Now Sega had to move to more markets. They closed the deal in 1987 to have the Master System distributed by Mastertronic in the United Kingdom. Advanced orders of the system were very high, but unfortunately the demand was not met, as units were not made until Boxing Day, making shipments late. Mastertronic sold the rest of their shares to Virgin to form Virgin Mastertronic, which took over all European distribution in 1988. By 1990, the Master System was the best-selling console in Europe, selling more than 918,000 consoles, greater than Nintendo's 655,000 units. This had European developers pushing to develop for the console, unlike in Japan or the United States. The Sega Master System was also very successful in Brazil, being marketed by Tectoy. The Sega Master System, although not initially successful, it did enjoy success in Europe, Brazil, and other parts of the world. Being released in Japan in 1985 and being discontinued in Brazil in 1998 gave the console an amazing 13-year run, with worldwide sales between Sega and Tectoy ranging between 20 to 21 million units.
Atari just reinvented the video game with this, the Atari 7800. Incredible, huh? So powerful it plays like the best arcade game with real joysticks, right? So advanced it plays super games, computer games no other video game system ever played. Just look at these. It even plays all Atari 2600 games. Great, huh? Hey, oh, the new Atari 7800. We reinvented the video game.
The story of the Atari 7800 starts in 1982. After the release of the Atari 5200, Atari was already getting complaints from consumers that the system was not that great. Controller issues, no backward compatibility with the 2600, and most of the games were the same arcade ports that were already on the 2600. Sales figures supported this, as the system was not selling well. Atari knew it had to come up with a new video game system to compete with the ColecoVision. But after Warner Communications took over the company from Nolan Bushnell, most of the brilliant engineers that Atari had left. So for the first time in Atari's history, they had to outsource a company to design their new game system. Right about this time, a small startup company named General Computer Corporation was making arcade mods for popular arcade machines. One of which was Super Missile Attack, a mod of Atari's Missile Command. Atari got wind of this and sued General Computer Corporation for copyright infringement. But once Atari saw the mods, they cut a deal with GCC to hire them to produce the mods under Atari's name. They also had them start developing arcade games for Atari as well, such as Food Fight and Quantum. Then Atari had them start development on the then called Atari 3600 video game console. It was to be backwards compatible with the 2600 and have arcade quality graphics that can compete with the ColecoVision. Development started in 1983 and was ready for production in 1984 with the launch of 15 titles, a high score cart, and it even had a keyboard accessory. It was renamed the Atari 7800 Pro system. But Atari was going through its own changes. The video game crash started in 1983 and with it took a lot of profit out of the gaming industry. Atari was at the heart of it due to so many bad games being released on the 2600. Warner Communications knew this and they wanted out. In 1984, Atari's consumer division was bought out by former Commodore president Jack Tramiel. It was Jack's decision to cancel the Atari 7800 project and shelve it due to the gaming consoles not being profitable after the crash, and Atari focused more on its computer division. Fast forward a couple years to 1986, with the release of Nintendo's NES and seeing how successful it was, Tramiel decided to unshelf the Atari 7800. Unfortunately for Atari, by this time the system was outdated and really was not a competitor to the NES or the Sega Master System. The system wasn't that successful, selling just over 100,000 units in 1986, far below what Nintendo had sold. A total of 57 games were released for the system. It was discontinued in 1992, along with the 2600 and the 8-bit line of computers.
This is the Nintendo video game system. It plays only cartridge games. This is the new Atari XE system. It plays cartridge and disc-based games. Disc drive sold separately, and only Atari comes with a real joystick. Both have guns, but only Atari comes with the target game Bug Hunt. Nintendo has a toy robot, but only Atari gives you a keyboard for playing advanced computer games. It even comes with the amazing Flight Simulator 2 cartridge. The new Atari XE video game system. Unbeatable.
The story of the XEGS starts way back in the 1970s. Nolan Bushnell had sold Atari to Time Warner Communications in 1976 to help pull Atari out of its financial bind. In 1977, Atari started development of a new 8-bit game console. As popular as the Atari 2600 was, it was underpowered and Atari knew this. The top executives at Atari saw how successful the personal computer market was becoming with the release of the Commodore PET, Apple II, and the TRS-80. In fact, 1977 is known as the year of the personal computer because of this. The top brass at Atari took the technology from the 8-bit game system that was being developed and turned it into the Atari 8-bit line of computers, the 400 and the 800. Nolan Bushnell and most of the engineers at Atari saw this as bad marketing and started to leave Atari at this point. Fast forward a few years to the early 1980s. Atari now had competition in the video game console market with the Intellivision and the ColecoVision, and they knew they had to come up with a system that had arcade quality graphics and sound. They reverse engineered the Atari 8-bit computer into a game console that we all know as the Atari 5200. In essence, the 5200 is an Atari 8-bit computer under the hood, but Atari made it so it was incompatible with the 8-bit computer carts, did not support a floppy or cassette drive, nor was it backboard compatible to the 2600 without the additional 2600 add-on. Along with the horrible analog controllers and the same arcade ports that were already on the 2600, consumers just didn't buy the system. It was right about this time in 1983 that the video game crash started, diminishing the video game market and making it unprofitable. A lot of companies pulled out of the market, and Time Warner was no different. In 1984, they sold Atari to former Commodore president Jack Tramiel. When Jack took over the company, his primary focus was on computers. He even shelved the then completed Atari 7800 game console because he thought releasing it after the crash would be unprofitable. But Nintendo released the NES in 1985 and took the gaming world by storm, showing video game consoles could be profitable once again. In 1986, Atari then released the 7800, but it was too late to compete with Nintendo and another new competitor, Sega. After seeing that the 7800 was not going to be the success they thought it would be, Atari had to come up with something quick to try to compete in the market. They went back to the hybrid console computer idea that they had with the 5200, but this time it would be compatible with the 8-bit carts, support drives, and have a keyboard, light gun, and even have BASIC on the ROM. It was marketed as a video game console that could be expanded to a full-blown computer. So Atari started development of the Atari XEGS. The XEGS is really a redesigned Atari 65 XE computer that was made to be a standalone video game console. The system was as powerful, if not more powerful, than either the NES or the Sega Master System. Atari thought they had a hit on their hands. The shell of the system was designed to fit the times, a radical case and fluorescent colored buttons along with the Buck Rogers styled light gun. It also had a redesigned detachable full QWERTY keyboard. But the reality of the system is far different than what it appeared. Atari made these systems as cheap as they could to get rid of the 8-bit component inventory, getting ready to discontinue the 8-bit computer systems, making way for the 16-bit line of ST computers. These systems are plagued with issues because of this. From failing system ROMs, cold solder joints, bad RAM, and MMU issues, the system was starting to get a bad reputation. Initial sales of the unit looked good, selling out of the 100,000 units that they made during the Christmas season, but sales slumped afterward as the build quality issues started to pop up. Also by this time, most people already had an NES or a Sega Master System. Atari supported the XEGS until 1992, when it was discontinued with the 2600, 7800, and the Atari 8-bit line of computers. The Atari XEGS had a 5-year lifespan from 1987 to 1992. It sold over 100,000 units and is considered to be the last 8-bit computer Atari produced. Or was it a console? You guys be the judge.
First, there was Atari. Then, there was Nintendo.
Now, the next generation video games. TurboGrafx 16 and TurboGrafx CD for live video games and 2,000 times more memory. Turbo Express Portable. Turbo Chip compatibility. Basic system $99.99. TurboGrafx 16. The next generation now.
The story of the NEC, PC Engine, and TurboGrafx 16 starts in the early 1980s. NEC, also known as Nippon Electronic Company, a communications company at the time, started getting into the home personal computing market. They developed a computer called the PC-88. By 1981, the PC-88 held 40% of Japan's personal computing market, and just like any other personal computer of the time, video games were a major portion of its market share. In 1982, Nintendo contacted NEC to help develop games for their upcoming Famicom system. The first few games developed for the Famicom were developed on the PC-88 because Nintendo hadn't completed their development kit yet. By working with Nintendo, NEC got the itch to get into the gaming market. They worked with a third-party developer, Hudson Soft, to acquire a license to port some of the Nintendo games over to the PC-88, including Excite Bike, Balloon Fight, Tennis, Golf, and Ice Climber. They even created 3 new Nintendo games just for the system: Super Mario Bros. Special, Punch Ball Mario Bros., and Donkey Kong 3. NEC really wanted to get into the gaming market at this time, but were afraid because of the video game crash and seeing other game companies fail. They watched the Famicom in Japan and the NES around the world become a huge success for Nintendo. They also saw Sega starting to have success as well, and they knew it was time to get into the market. By this time, NEC had released a PC-98, which was a 16-bit microcomputer and eventually evolved into a 32-bit machine. This gave NEC an advantage as they were already working within the 16-bit realm. By 1986, Hudson and NEC partnered up to start development of a new video game system. Earlier, Hudson had contacted Nintendo to try and sell them the advanced chipset for their next video game console, but Nintendo declined, so Hudson found a new partner in NEC. Hudson had developed an 8-bit CPU that essentially was the same as the 65 CO2 processor. They coupled this processor with 2 16-bit graphic processors, the first one being the video display controller and the second being a video color encoder. Development of the console was quick due to most of the hardware already being completed. NEC already had software support from Hudson, but also brought in other third-party developers such as Namco and Konami to develop games for the system. They released the PC Engine on October 30th, 1987 in Japan. It instantly became a hit, selling more than 500,000 units in the first week, taking the lead in the Japanese gaming market. The system had good quality games from great third-party developers, a small but elegant design, and had a small compact credit card-sized game cartridge called a HuCard. With the success that NEC was having with the PC Engine, most would think that this would be the end of the story. However, it was just the beginning. NEC decided that they were going to do 2 things in 1988. 1, they would expand the market to North America, and 2, they would create a new CD-ROM add-on for the PC Engine. Development of the North American PC Engine started. However, it was found that Americans like things big and not small, so they decided to make the console bigger. Also, the name PC Engine was not very popular with the polls taken in America, so they decided to name the new system the TurboGrafx 16, based off its 16-bit video chip architecture. But development of the system was a slow process and delayed the release in North America. Meanwhile, in Japan, development of the CD-ROM was moving along quickly, and by December of 1988, it was released. This made the PC Engine the very first video game console to use the CD-ROM media format. They sold over 60,000 units in the first 5 months, and by the end of the third fiscal quarter of 1989, sold more than 80,000 CD-ROM units, and 1.2 million PC Engine consoles. By mid-1989, development of the North American TurboGrafx 16 had been completed, and the consoles were beginning to be produced. It launched in August of 1989 in limited quantities in Los Angeles and New York test markets. Unfortunately for NEC, this was 2 weeks after Sega launched the Genesis in America with the arcade hit Altered Beast packed in. Unlike NEC, Sega didn't waste time redesigning the console for the American market and launched it as quickly as they could with a great pack-in game, while NEC wasted almost 2 years for the Americanized console to be developed and packed in the game Keith Courage in Alpha Zones, which really nobody in North America was familiar with. The TurboGrafx 16 add-on released shortly after, but was priced at $399 by itself and no pack-in games. Because of all this, unlike the Japanese market, Sega dominated NEC in North America. Making matters worse, in NEC's contract, Hudson got paid for each console that was produced, sold or not, and they made 750,000 units in the stagnant North American market, costing NEC millions. Now, over in Japan, things were a lot different. In fact, sales of the PC Engine were skyrocketing, and they launched 3 new models of the PC Engine in 1989. The first called the PC Engine Core Graphics. Other than a slightly updated CPU and the addition of composite AV instead of RF video, it was essentially the same as the PC Engine, just with a different color scheme being black and blue instead of white and red, and it had an updated controller with turbo capabilities. The second model was the PC Engine Super Graphics, which was an enhanced PC Engine with upgraded RAM, a second video display controller, and a video display processor to combine the VDCs. It also had an updated CPU. However, the system was quite expensive and was not very popular. Only 5 exclusive games were released for it, and it was soon cancelled. The third model was the PC Engine Shuttle. It was a cost-reduced version of the PC Engine targeted towards children, and it was shaped somewhat like a spaceship. In fact, if you look closely, I think Atari took some design cues from this for their Atari Jaguar. This also had AV out, with the main difference being it had no expansion port, so it could not be connected to the CD-ROM add-on. This model was somewhat successful in Japan and was also distributed in South Korea. Also in 1989, NEC released a PC Engine in Europe, starting with France. It was a well-liked console in France, with major retailers selling the console. But by this time, NEC was seeing the TurboGrafx 16 in North America not being successful, and decided to cancel the rest of the European launch. The units that were produced for the UK were North American units converted to PAL. NEC sold this inventory to distributors. Telegames released the console in 1990 in very limited quantities. In 1990, NEC released another new model of the PC Engine, but this time it was to take your games on the go. The PC Engine GT was released in Japan on December 1st, 1990, and then in the United States as the Turbo Express. It was a portable version of the PC Engine with a backlit 2.6-inch LCD screen, which at the time was way more advanced than Nintendo's Game Boy. However, because of its high price and its short battery life, it didn't do too well in the market. NEC was way ahead of its time, looking at the success of the Nintendo Switch now. Speaking of Nintendo, the Super Famicom launched in Japan on November of 1990, giving NEC true competition with Nintendo for the first time. By mid-1991, NEC had finally sold the 750,000 units that were produced in 1989 in North America. But on a positive note, worldwide they had sold over 500,000 CD-ROM units. In June, NEC released the CoreGrafx 2. They put the original HU-C6280 CPU back into the unit and changed the case colors again. Nintendo released the SNES in North America in August. In September, NEC releases the PC Engine Duo in Japan. This combines the PC Engine and the CD-ROM all in one unit. Once again, this unit becomes successful in Japan. In December, NEC releases two new products in Japan. The Super CD-ROM, which had an updated BIOS, increased RAM to 256 kilobits, and was able to directly connect to the back of the PC Engine without an adapter. They also released the PC Engine LT, which was a PC Engine in a laptop form factor with an attached screen. It did not have its own battery, so you had to plug it in for power. Not too many of these consoles were made, and they're very rare today. By mid-1992, NEC and Hudson had agreed to transfer management in North America over to a joint venture called Turbo Technologies Incorporated. This was a move to try to remarket the TurboGrafx 16 in North America. In October, they released the Turbo Duo in North America, but by this time, they faced stiff competition with Nintendo and Sega, which were currently dominating the market. The numbers don't lie, and the TurboGrafx 16 and the Turbo Duo just were not successful outside of Japan. In Japan, the PC Engine Duo was selling well. In fact, two updated versions were made, the PC Engine Duo R, released in 1993, and the PC Engine Duo RX in 1994. These consoles essentially had cosmetic changes from the original, but the RX included a new 6-button controller. By the end of 1994, things were definitely taking a toll on NEC. The lucrative gaming market that they had held a lead in the market share in Japan initially had faded long away. Nintendo and Sega were dominating the market, and a newcomer Sony was on the horizon. NEC discontinued the PC Engine and TurboGrafx 16 in 1994 in North America, Japan, and France. And at this point, Turbo Technologies Incorporated discontinued the Turbo Duo in North America as well. While in Japan, the PC Engine Duo lasted another year until 1995. But amazingly, the last licensed game for the PC Engine was Dead on the Brain Part 1 and 2, which was released on June 3, 1999 in the Super CD format. The PC Engine was released in 1987 and the TurboGrafx in 1989. They were completely discontinued by 1995, giving the console an 8-year lifespan and being the first video game console to use the CD-ROM media format.
And so it was, late in the 20th century, that a pox fell upon the land, a plague of home videos that were limited in intelligence. There was brain drain, and terminal boredom swept the countryside. The maker looked down and was not pleased by what he saw, and said, "This is not good." And so it was, he brought forth Genesis, a system with twice the power, twice the intelligence, twice the challenge, twice the fun. Only a chosen few were called forth to experience this new dimension of high-definition graphics and stereo sound. And the maker saw what he had done and said, "Now that's not bad. Discover Genesis, and your world will never be the same."
The story of the Sega Genesis actually started in the early 1980s. Sega's arcade sales were starting to slump, and they saw the need to get into the home console market. The push to get into the home console market was led by Sega Enterprises Limited president Oyoya Nakayama. In 1983, Sega released the SG-1000 in Japan, but the system didn't fare well against Nintendo's Famicom. In 1984, Sega arranged a buyout of their owner, Gulf and Western, which Sega was a subsidiary of. Nakayama was named president of the newly formed Sega Enterprises. Within 2 years of the SG-1000's release, Sega released another console named the Mark III. Now we all in North America know the Mark III as the Sega Master System, which was released here in the United States in 1986 to compete with the Nintendo in the American market. However, just like in Japan unfortunately, the Master System wasn't very successful, which Sega already anticipated, and within just a few days of launching the Master System in the United States, work already began on a new console. With two of Sega's best R&D engineers at the helm, Hideki Sato and Masumi Ishikawa. In 1987, another stroke of bad luck hit Sega. NEC, one of Japan's biggest electronic companies, decided to launch the PC Engine. Sega at this point saw the need for a 16-bit system because of the release of the PC Engine, and rumors of a 16-bit console being developed by Nintendo. So the decision was made by Ishikawa to develop a system with a 16-bit microprocessor and a second 8-bit Zilog coprocessor to help take the load off the main processor for the system sound. The exterior of the console was designed to emulate the look of audio equipment at the time, and also the interior of automobiles. This decision was made to distance itself from toy-looking consoles, hoping to attract older consumers. The Mega Drive was released in Japan on October 29, 1988. Unfortunately for Sega, its release was 1 week after the Super Mario Bros. 3 game was released on the Nintendo. And with the PC Engine being very popular in Japan as well, Sega was running a distant third in the console race. Sega now knew at this point it needed to act in North America, and fast. Tonka, the American toy company, was distributing the Master System for the Sega at the time, but Sega was not impressed by their marketing tactics. So for the Sega Genesis distribution, they decided to seek help from another company. Sega then contacted Atari and made a proposal with CEO Jack Tramiel, but Tramiel refused the offer, instead deciding to work on the Atari ST line of computers. So at this point, Sega basically said screw everybody and opened its own Sega of America division to handle marketing and distribution of the Sega Genesis. The Genesis launched to a limited market just like the NES did previously. This was done to test the American market before the full release. It was launched in New York City and Los Angeles on August 14, 1989. Due to the successful sales of the console, it was released to the rest of the United States later that year in several batches. Sega in different parts of the world decided to distribute the console through different companies as well. It was released in Europe and Brazil in September of 1990, and in other parts of the world with different distributors on various dates. Marketing in North America was handled by former Atari Corporation Entertainment Electronics Division President Michael Katz. He wanted to market the system for its arcade-like gameplay and graphics, and came up with the slogan, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't." But by mid-1990, Katz did not reach the sales goal set by Nakayama for 1 million units sold, and only 500,000 were sold. So at this point, Nakayama fired and replaced him with Tom Kalinske. He saw that Nintendo was successful with having iconic video game characters like Mario and wanted to repeat that kind of success. At this point, Sega's mascot was Alex the Kid. Although popular in Japan, in North America, nobody really knew him and didn't relate to the character. Sonic was made to show the speed and graphic capabilities of the Genesis, along with being a cool character, as Sega was trying to reach a cooler crowd of gamers. The strategy worked and sales of the Genesis increased. Other marketing techniques were put in place, like reducing the cost of the console, hiring developers that targeted American audiences, and a very aggressive ad campaign. Sega was also successful in creating different add-ons for the system, with the addition of the power-based converter, the 32X, and the Sega CD. The Genesis had reached the 32-bit and CD-ROM game market, and having backward capability to the Master System helped sales of the older Master System games as well. Sega also showed their hand in the rating system for video games. In the early to mid-1990s, watchdog groups were condemning video games for the violence that they portrayed. Sega even went to congressional hearings because of games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap during these proceedings. The video game rating system was set up by December of 1994 and was being put on video games. But since there was a rating system now, Sega decided to release Mortal Kombat 2 completely uncensored and not having to use a code to get the blood or fatalities. They were really the first to test the system, and it worked, as we can see by games that are released today. Sega discontinued the Genesis in 1997, selling over 30 million units worldwide. Another 4.5 million units were sold by other distribution companies worldwide as well, bringing the total to about 35 million consoles, with most of these sales being in North America and in Europe. Sega finally achieved success in the home console market with help of great marketing and one little hedgehog.
They said it wasn't humanly possible, but now you can have all the power and excitement of Nintendo right in the palm of your hand. Introducing Game Boy. It's portable, it's in stereo, and its games are interchangeable. Plus, Game Boy comes with the outrageous new game, Tetris. And for head-to-head competition, use the revolutionary video link and blow your opponent away. Game Boy, only from Nintendo. Now you're playing with power, portable power.
The story of the Game Boy starts in the mid-1980s. Gunpei Yokoi held a meeting with Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, about developing a portable game system with interchangeable cartridges, somewhat like the Milton Bradley Microvision years earlier. However, they would implement a newer screen LCD technology called dot matrix. With the popularity of the Game & Watch and its portable design and the success of the Famicom and NES, Yamauchi was not hesitant to give the go-ahead to start development. Yokoi and Nintendo's R&D 1 team, led by Satoru Okada, started development of the new system called the Dot Matrix game. Because a joystick would be unpractical on the system, Yokoi wanted to use the D-pad he created on the Game & Watch. Since the NES controller was so popular, they made the controller design almost identical to the NES with the D-pad, A, B, start, and select buttons. Also, the system had to be small enough to fit in one's pocket. Unlike the Microvision, Nintendo wanted the CPU to be in the system and not on the individual cartridges. For the CPU, Nintendo worked with Sharp to create a custom chip that was a hybrid between the Intel 8080 and the Zilog Z80 CPU. The screen would be a 2.6-inch LCD dot matrix display with a 160 by 144 pixel resolution. During the design phase, Shigetsu Ito saw the prototype and named it the Game Boy. The name stuck, but the dot matrix game name still appeared on the Game Boy as a model number, DMG01. However, not everything was great. Employees within Nintendo didn't like the Game Boy and thought it wouldn't be successful. They even deemed it the Dame game, which Dame means helpless or useless in Japanese. Despite this, development continued on. In 1987, Nintendo had shown the prototype to several trade shows. Interest grew in the product. Gunpei Yokoi wanted the system to have a great game library. With the popularity of Super Mario Bros. On the NES, they knew the system needed a Mario game for it. Gunpei Yokoi and Sudaru Yokata developed Super Mario Land. It was intended to be the pack-in game with the system worldwide. However, interest in the Russian game Tetris in North America was peaking in popularity at the time, and Nintendo saw this as an opportunity. Hank Rogers bought the rights to the game and worked with Nintendo to port it over to the Game Boy. Tetris was the pack-in game for the system in every region except Japan. Nintendo spent over $10 million marketing the Game Boy before launch. The Game Boy was released in Japan in April of 1989 with the pack-in game Super Mario Land. Then it was released in North America in July and Europe in September of 1990, with Tetris being the pack-in game. The system was wildly successful. In Japan, Nintendo sold out of the entire inventory by March and had to produce more. The system was just as popular around the globe, selling millions of units within the first year. 6 games were available at launch: Alleyway, Baseball, Super Mario Land, Tennis, Tetris, and Yakuman. With sales of the console soaring, so did the number of game titles. By 1990, Nintendo had competition with NEC, Sega, and Atari with the PC Engine Express, Turbo GT, Game Gear, and Lynx. But the Game Boy turned out to be the clear winner in this competition. Although it was not as advanced as the others without a color backlit screen, the fact that it had a 14-hour battery life and a lower price made it the leader of the portable game systems of the time. Nintendo was always thinking ahead and started to think of new ways to market and make the Game Boy better. The first revision of the Game Boy came in 1995 with the Play It Loud Game Boy. These were special edition Game Boys with different color cases that came in red, green, black, yellow, blue, and a clear case. In 1996, Nintendo released the Game Boy Pocket, a smaller cost-reduced version of the original DMG Game Boy. It took 2 AAA batteries instead of 4 AA's the original Game Boy took. The screen was changed to a slightly larger 2.56-inch FSTN LCD, which made the screen truly black and white and not the green color the OG Game Boy was, but still was not backlit. Also, the power jack and the link port shrunk in size. In 1997, the Pocket introduced different color cases. By 1998, Nintendo released the Game Boy Color. It had a 2.32-inch color LCD display that was still not backlit. It had its own games that were made in color and was backward compatible to the original Game Boy games as well. Also in 1998, they released the Game Boy Light in Japan. This was a little larger than the Game Boy Pocket, but boasted for the first time an electroluminescent backlit screen. It used two AA batteries and was available in two colors, gold and silver. In 2001, Nintendo released the advanced version of the Game Boy that would be backward compatible with all previous games and have its own new library of games as well. This system was the Game Boy Advance. Through its life cycle, it had its own revisions, such as the Game Boy Advance SP and Game Boy Advance Micro. The original Game Boy architecture was finally discontinued in 2003, being launched in 1989, giving the system an amazing 14-year run, and selling more than 118 million units, making it one of the most successful game consoles ever, either at home or portable.
Game over, man! It's game over!